long before the great kingdoms of Europe carved their names into history, long before the Incas built their mountain fortresses and the Aztecs raised their pyramid temples, there existed a civilization in southern Africa that mastered the secrets of gold, trade, and power. A kingdom so advanced, so wealthy, so strategically brilliant that it commanded respect across an entire subcontinent. Yet today, most of the world has never heard its name. This is the story of Mapungubwe, Africa's first gold empire, a kingdom that rose from the dust of the savannah to become one of the most sophisticated societies of the medieval world, only to vanish without explanation, leaving behind mysteries that scholars are still trying to unravel nearly 1,000 years later. The year is 1075 CE. While European knights wage holy wars in distant lands and Chinese emperors consolidate their dynasties, something extraordinary is happening at the confluence of the Limpopo and Shashe rivers in what is now the border region between South Africa, Zimbabwe, and Botswana. Here, in a landscape of baobab trees and sandstone cliffs, a civilization is being born that will rewrite everything we think we know about African history. If you're fascinated by the hidden chapters of history, the stories that were deliberately erased or simply forgotten by time, then you've found the right place. This channel is dedicated to bringing you the epic tales of civilizations, leaders, and empires that changed the world but never made it into your history textbooks. Subscribe now. The Limpopo River Valley in the 11th century was not the empty wilderness that colonial narratives would later describe. It was a crossroads of civilizations, a meeting point of cultures, languages, and ambitions. For centuries, Bantu-speaking peoples had been migrating southward, bringing with them advanced knowledge of agriculture, metallurgy, and social organization. They were not primitive wanderers. They were skilled farmers who understood the rhythms of the African climate, expert metalworkers who could extract iron from the earth and forge it into tools and weapons, and sophisticated traders who recognized the value of the resources beneath their feet. The landscape itself was both generous and demanding. The region experienced seasonal rainfall that could transform the savanna into fertile grazing land, supporting herds of cattle that would become the foundation of wealth and power. But the climate was also unpredictable, with droughts that could devastate communities unprepared for its fury. Only those who understood how to read the land, how to store surplus, how to manage resources across good years and bad, could hope to build something lasting. It was cattle that first created distinction among these early communities. In the social and economic systems of southern African peoples, cattle were far more than livestock. They were currency, status symbols, instruments of political alliance, and sacred connections to ancestors. A man's wealth was measured in cattle, a chief's power was demonstrated by the size of his herds. Marriages were sealed with cattle, disputes were settled with cattle. The entire social fabric was woven around these animals, and those who controlled the largest herds naturally rose to positions of leadership. But cattle alone could not build an empire. What transformed this region from a collection of pastoral communities into a kingdom was gold. The hills and valleys of the Limpopo Basin contained deposits of gold that had lain untouched for millennia. The local peoples had known about these deposits, had even worked gold into ornaments and objects of ritual significance, but they had not yet recognized its true value in the wider world. That realization came through contact with traders from the East. The Indian Ocean trade network was one of the great commercial systems of the medieval world, connecting East Africa with the Arabian Peninsula, Persia, India, and ultimately China. Arab and Swahili merchants had established trading posts along the East African coast, creating prosperous port cities like Kilwa, Sofala, and Mozambique. These merchants brought cloth, beads, ceramics, and other luxury goods from across the ocean. What they sought in return was ivory and gold. When word reached the interior that coastal traders were willing to exchange extraordinary goods for gold, the economic equation of the Limpopo Valley changed overnight. Gold, which had been merely decorative, suddenly became the key to accessing a world of wealth. But extracting gold, refining it, transporting it to the coast, and negotiating with foreign traders required organization, coordination, and power. It required a state. This is where Mapungubwe's story truly begins. Around the year 1075, a group of settlements in the Limpopo Valley began to coalesce around a single center of power. Archaeological evidence shows that this was not a violent conquest, but rather a gradual process of consolidation, where one lineage's political and economic advantages allowed them to attract followers, absorb neighboring communities, and establish themselves as the paramount authority in the region. The site they chose for their capital was a natural fortress. Rising abruptly from the surrounding savanna was a flat-topped sandstone hill, its sheer cliffs providing natural defenses on all sides. Access to the summit was possible through only a few narrow paths that could be easily defended. From the top, one could see for miles in every direction, monitoring the movement of people, cattle, and potential threats. It was the perfect seat of power for an emerging kingdom. The rulers of Mapungubwe made a decision that would define their civilization. They declared the hilltop sacred, a place where only the royal family and their closest advisors could reside. This physical separation of the ruling class from the common people was not arbitrary. It was a deliberate strategy of power, creating a visible and permanent symbol of social hierarchy. The king and his court lived on the hill, closer to the heavens, closer to the ancestors, elevated above ordinary mortals in every sense. The common people lived in the settlements below, able to see their rulers but unable to approach without permission. This separation served multiple purposes. It enhanced the mystique and authority of the kingship, surrounding the ruler with an aura of divine sanction. It provided security, making assassination or coup attempts extraordinarily difficult. And it created a clear architectural representation of the social order, one that could be understood at a glance by anyone who saw the hill rising above the settlements. Life on the hilltop was unlike anything else in the region. Archaeological excavations have revealed the remains of substantial structures built with stone foundations and clay walls. These were not simple huts, but elaborate buildings designed for comfort and status. The royal compound included areas for administration, ritual ceremonies, and private residence. Artifacts found on the hill speak to a life of considerable luxury. Imported glass beads from India, Chinese ceramics, Persian pottery, Arabian glassware, and of course, abundant gold ornaments. The ordinary citizens of Mapungubwe lived in the settlements that surrounded the base of the sacred hill, their lives defined by agriculture, herding, and craftsmanship. These were not impoverished subjects but participants in a thriving economy. The kingdom's prosperity depended on their labor, their skills, and their production. Farmers cultivated sorghum and millet, crops perfectly adapted to the semi-arid climate. Herders managed the vast cattle herds that grazed across the savanna. Artisans worked iron into tools and weapons, crafted pottery for daily use and ritual purposes, and created the intricate beadwork that served as both decoration and status indicator. The social structure of Mapungubwe was complex and carefully maintained. Below the royal family were layers of nobility, administrators and specialists who managed different aspects of the kingdom's affairs. There were officials responsible for collecting tribute from subject communities, others who supervised mining operations, trade negotiators who dealt with coastal merchants, military leaders who protected the kingdom's borders, and ritual specialists who maintained the religious practices that legitimized royal authority. One of the most remarkable aspects of Mapungubwe's society was its engagement with long-distance trade. The kingdom was not isolated in the interior of Africa, cut off from global commerce. It was connected through elaborate trade routes to the Indian Ocean system, making it part of a commercial network that spanned half the globe. Gold and ivory flowed from Mapungubwe to the coast, where they were exchanged for goods that came from as far away as China and Indonesia. The trade route from Mapungubwe to the coast was approximately 400 kilometers, a journey that took weeks on foot through challenging terrain. Professional traders made this journey regularly, forming caravans that moved back and forth between the interior and the port of Sofala on the Mozambique coast. These were not random expeditions, but carefully organized commercial ventures. The traders needed to navigate not only the physical landscape, but also the political landscape, passing through territories controlled by various chieftains, each expecting some form of payment or recognition. The goods that arrived in Mapungubwe from this trade were transformative. Glass beads became a crucial element of social display and wealth storage. Different types and colors of beads carried different values and meanings. They were worn as jewelry, sewn into clothing, and used in ceremonial contexts. The variety and quantity of beads one possessed indicated social status. Archaeological excavations have found tens of thousands of these beads, indicating just how central they were to Mapungubwe's culture. But perhaps nothing symbolizes Mapungubwe's wealth and sophistication more than a single artifact discovered in 1933, an object so extraordinary that it has become the symbol of this lost civilization. It was a small sculpture, just 12 centimeters long and 7 centimeters tall, depicting a rhinoceros. But this was no ordinary carving. The entire sculpture was covered in gold foil, expertly worked and applied to create a shimmering masterpiece, the golden rhinoceros of Mapungubwe. This artifact tells us multiple things about the kingdom. First, it demonstrates advanced metalworking skills. The gold foil was beaten to an incredibly thin and uniform thickness, then carefully applied to a wooden core, using techniques that required both knowledge and precision. Second, it reveals artistic sensibility. The rhinoceros is rendered with careful attention to naturalistic detail, showing that the craftsmen of Mapungubwe were not just technically skilled, but artistically sophisticated. Third, it speaks to the centrality of gold in the kingdom's culture. This was not merely an economic commodity, but a material with deep, symbolic and ritual significance. The golden rhinoceros was found in a royal burial site on the hilltop, placed there as part of the grave goods accompanying a deceased ruler. This burial practice itself reveals much about Mapungubwe's beliefs and values. The dead were not simply disposed of, but were ceremonially interred with objects that would accompany them to the afterlife or demonstrate their status for eternity. Royal burials included not just the golden rhinoceros, but also thousands of gold beads, gold bangles, iron implements, ceremonial staffs, and pottery vessels. These burial practices also reveal the kingdom's social stratification. Common people were buried in simple graves with minimal grave goods. Elite individuals were buried with moderate amounts of gold and imported items. But royal burials were spectacular, containing wealth that would have taken lifetimes to accumulate. This was a society where inequality was not hidden but displayed, where hierarchy was considered natural and proper, where the distance between king and commoner was as vast as the distance between the hilltop and the valley floor. The economy of Mapungubwe was based on multiple pillars, not just trade. Agriculture provided the food surplus necessary to support specialists who did not farm. Cattle herding created mobile wealth and sustained cultural practices. Mining and metalworking supplied both trade goods and the tools necessary for economic production. Craft production created items for local use and exchange, and trade brought in luxury goods that reinforced the power of the elite. Gold mining in the Mapungubwe kingdom was not the industrial-scale operation of later centuries. It was artisanal mining, where individuals or small groups would identify gold-bearing deposits in rivers or exposed rock faces, then extract the precious metal through labor-intensive processes. Gold was found in alluvial deposits, washed down from higher elevations and concentrated in riverbeds. Miners would pan these deposits, separating gold from sediment. They also extracted gold from quartz reefs, heating the rock and then rapidly cooling it to create fractures, then breaking it apart and extracting the gold-bearing material. The refining process required additional skill. Raw gold needed to be melted and purified, removing impurities and combining multiple small fragments into usable ingots or beads. This required reaching high temperatures and maintaining controlled conditions. The metalworkers of Mapungubwe mastered these techniques, producing gold of remarkable purity. Ivory was the other major export commodity. Elephants roamed the region in great numbers, and elephant hunting was both a practical necessity for protecting agricultural fields and a source of valuable trade goods. Elephant tusks were highly prized in foreign markets, carved into decorative objects, religious items, and luxury goods. A single large tusk could be worth an enormous quantity of trade goods. The kingdom's territory expanded gradually during the 12th century. Mapungubwe's rulers did not necessarily conquer neighboring communities through military force. Instead, they extended their influence through a combination of economic advantage, political alliance, and strategic marriages. Communities that recognized Mapungubwe's paramount authority and paid tribute gained access to the kingdom's trade networks and the protection of its military power. Those that resisted found themselves isolated and vulnerable. By the mid-12th century, Mapungubwe controlled a territory that extended across the modern borders of South Africa, Botswana, and Zimbabwe. This was not a tightly administered empire with direct bureaucratic control over distant provinces. Rather, it was a hierarchical system where the Mapungubwe king was recognized as the paramount ruler. Various regional chiefs governed their territories with considerable autonomy, and tribute flowed upward, while trade goods and royal patronage flowed downward. The political system that emerged at Mapungubwe was sophisticated, balancing the authority of the central ruler with the autonomy of subordinate chiefs. The king was not an absolute monarch who could simply command obedience. His power depended on maintaining a complex web of relationships, obligations, and reciprocal benefits. Chiefs who provided tribute and loyalty expected royal generosity in return, protection when threatened, support during times of drought or crisis, and opportunities to participate in the profitable trade networks. This political balance was maintained through regular assemblies, ceremonial gift-giving, strategic marriages that linked powerful families, and the distribution of prestige goods that demonstrated the king's wealth and generosity. A wise king understood that his power was not taken, but continuously negotiated, earned through demonstrated ability to bring prosperity to the entire kingdom. Religious and ritual practices reinforced royal authority. The king was not just a political leader, but a sacred figure with special connections to the ancestors and the spiritual forces that governed fertility, rainfall, and prosperity. Royal rituals were performed on the hilltop, away from common view, creating an air of mystery and power. When the king appeared before his people, it was a ceremonial occasion, carefully staged to emphasize his elevated status. The ancestors played a central role in Mapungubwe's spiritual worldview. It was believed that the deceased remained present and influential, mediating between the living and the divine forces of the cosmos. Royal ancestors were particularly powerful, their spirits watching over the kingdom and its people. Proper respect had to be paid through offerings, ceremonies, and the maintenance of sacred sites. The king, as the living representative of the royal lineage, was responsible for these practices and derived authority from his role as intermediary between the people and their protective ancestors. Rainfall divination was particularly important in this semi-arid environment. The king's ability to predict rains, to perform rituals that seemingly brought rainfall, or at least his willingness to be held accountable for rainfall patterns, was a crucial component of his legitimacy. When rains came and harvests were good, the king's spiritual power was confirmed. When droughts struck, the king's position could become precarious, as people questioned whether he had lost the favor of the ancestors. The architectural achievements of Mapungubwe, while not as monumental as the pyramids of Egypt or the stone cities of later African kingdoms, were nevertheless impressive for their context. The hilltop compound represented a significant engineering accomplishment. Building substantial structures on a flat-topped hill with steep sides required transporting all materials up narrow paths, a logistical challenge that demanded organization and labor mobilization. The stone terracing that helped prevent erosion and created level platforms for buildings showed sophisticated understanding of construction techniques. But Mapungubwe's true architectural legacy may be its influence on later developments. Approximately 200 kilometers to the northeast, another hilltop settlement was beginning to grow during Mapungubwe's later period. This site would eventually become Great Zimbabwe, the famous stone city that represents the pinnacle of medieval southern African civilization. The connections between Mapungubwe and Great Zimbabwe are undeniable. Similar settlement patterns, shared ceramic traditions, continuation of the gold and ivory trade networks, and the same basic political structure of sacred hills and divine kingship. Some scholars believe Great Zimbabwe was founded by people who migrated from the Mapungubwe region, bringing with them the cultural templates and political ideas that had been developed at the earlier kingdom. Others suggest that Great Zimbabwe emerged independently but was heavily influenced by Mapungubwe's example, adopting and adapting ideas that had proven successful. Either way, Mapungubwe clearly served as a cultural and political model for the civilizations that followed. Life in Mapungubwe during its golden age, from roughly 1075 to 1220, was complex and varied depending on one's social position. For the royal family and noble elite, life was comfortable by medieval standards. They consumed the finest foods, wore elaborate jewelry and imported textiles, lived in substantial buildings, and enjoyed the fruits of the kingdom's trade wealth. Their days were filled with administrative duties, ritual obligations, and the intricate social maneuvering required to maintain power in a hierarchical society. For the common farmers and herders, life was harder but not without its rewards. They worked the land, tended animals, and produced the food surplus that supported the entire society. But they also participated in the kingdom's prosperity. The peace and stability provided by effective governance allowed them to farm without constant fear of raids. Access to iron tools improved agricultural productivity. Trade networks brought goods that enhanced daily life. Community ceremonies and celebrations provided social cohesion and entertainment. Craftspeople occupied a middle position in the social hierarchy. Skilled blacksmiths, potters, beadworkers, and other artisans were valued for their abilities. They produced items for both daily use and elite consumption, and the best craftspeople could achieve considerable prosperity and status. Metalworkers in particular held special positions because their skills were considered almost magical, transforming rocks into metals through processes that involved fire, specialized knowledge, and ritual. Women's roles in Mapungubwe society are harder to reconstruct from the archaeological record, but evidence suggests they held significant positions in both the economy and social structure. Women were crucial in agricultural production, food processing, and pottery making. Some women clearly held elite status, as indicated by rich female burials with abundant gold and trade goods. Whether women could hold political leadership positions remains debated, but their economic and social importance is undeniable. The kingdom's military capabilities, while not extensively documented, must have been formidable. Mapungubwe's ability to maintain control over an extensive territory and protect valuable trade routes required organized military force. Warriors would have been equipped with iron-tipped spears, shields, and possibly bows and arrows. Military leadership was likely connected to the broader political hierarchy, with regional chiefs responsible for mobilizing fighting men from their territories when needed. But for all its sophistication, wealth and power, the kingdom of Mapungubwe was approaching a crisis that would ultimately lead to its abandonment. The signs of trouble appeared gradually during the early 13th century. The causes of what happened next remain one of the great mysteries of African history, debated by scholars and archaeologists who have pieced together fragmentary evidence to try to understand why a thriving kingdom suddenly collapsed. The first signs that something was changing in the Limpopo Valley appeared around the year 1220. Archaeological evidence shows subtle shifts in settlement patterns, changes in pottery styles, and a gradual decrease in the volume of imported trade goods found at the site. These were not dramatic, sudden changes, but the beginning of a slow transformation that would eventually lead to Mapungubwe's abandonment. Climate change appears to have been a significant factor, though not the only one. Paleoclimatic research using tree rings, sediment cores, and other evidence indicates that the early 13th century saw the beginning of a shift toward cooler and drier conditions in southern Africa. This was not a sudden catastrophic drought, but a gradual change in rainfall patterns that made the Limpopo Valley increasingly marginal for the kind of intensive agriculture and large cattle herds that had supported Mapungubwe's population. In a society where the king's legitimacy depended partly on bringing rainfall and prosperity, declining environmental conditions created a political crisis as well as an economic one. When the rains became less reliable, when harvests began to fail more frequently, when cattle herds could not find sufficient grazing, people began to question whether the royal family had lost the favor of their ancestors. Drought in such societies was never just a natural disaster. It was a sign of spiritual imbalance, an indication that something was wrong in the relationship between the living, the dead, and the divine forces of nature. The economic model that had made Mapungubwe wealthy also became problematic under changing conditions. The kingdom's prosperity depended on producing agricultural surpluses to feed a population that included many non-farmers, maintaining large cattle herds as a form of wealth, and mining gold and ivory for export. As environmental conditions deteriorated, all of these economic pillars became harder to sustain. Less reliable rainfall meant smaller harvests and less surplus. Reduced grazing meant cattle herds had to be moved to new areas or reduced in size. Wildlife populations, including elephants, may have declined or shifted their ranges, making ivory harder to obtain. At the same time, the trade networks that connected Mapungubwe to the coast were changing. The port of Sofala, which had been the primary outlet for interior gold, was experiencing political turbulence. Competition between different merchant groups, conflicts with local rulers, and the constant political dynamics of the Swahili coast created uncertainties in the trade routes. If the coastal markets became less reliable or less profitable, the incentive for interior kingdoms to produce gold for export diminished. There is also evidence that the gold deposits closest to Mapungubwe were becoming depleted. The richest and most easily accessible surface deposits had been worked for over a century. Extracting gold from deeper or less concentrated deposits required more labor for less return. If gold production was declining at the same time that trade conditions were becoming less favorable, the economic foundation of the kingdom would have been severely weakened. But perhaps the most significant factor in Mapungubwe's decline was the rise of an alternative center of power to the northeast. Great Zimbabwe was emerging as a major force in the region, located in an area with more reliable rainfall, closer to important gold deposits, and positioned to control trade routes to the coast. Great Zimbabwe offered what Mapungubwe could no longer guarantee: stability, prosperity, and connections to the lucrative Indian Ocean trade. Population movements appear to have begun around 1240. The archaeological record shows that the number of settlements around the Mapungubwe Hill began to decrease. People were leaving, migrating northward toward the Great Zimbabwe region. This was not a panicked flight, but a gradual relocation as families and communities made calculated decisions about where their best opportunities lay. For the royal family and the elite who had built their power at Mapungubwe, this population loss created an impossible situation. A king without subjects is not a king. As the population declined, so did the labor force for agriculture, the warriors for defense, the miners for gold production, and the entire economic system that had sustained the kingdom. The elaborate political structure that had seemed so solid began to unravel as the foundation of population and production eroded beneath it. We can only imagine the final years of Mapungubwe. Perhaps there were attempts to reverse the decline, royal rituals performed with increasing desperation to bring back the rains and prosperity. Perhaps there were political conflicts as rival factions blamed each other for the crisis. Perhaps the last kings watched helplessly as their kingdoms slowly emptied, unable to stop the tide of migration toward more promising lands. By approximately 1290, the hilltop was abandoned. The royal compound stood empty, its buildings gradually weathering in the sun and rain. The settlements below had been deserted, their inhabitants scattered across the landscape or relocated to Great Zimbabwe and other emerging centers. The kingdom of Mapungubwe, which had been the dominant power in southern Africa for over 2 centuries, had ceased to exist. But the abandonment was not complete destruction. Unlike many archaeological sites that were destroyed by conquest or catastrophe, Mapungubwe was simply left behind. The royal burials remained undisturbed in the earth. The artifacts were not looted. The structures were not deliberately destroyed. The site was abandoned but essentially intact, as if frozen in time, waiting for centuries until someone would return to discover what had been left behind. Local communities in the region retained some memory of the site's significance. Oral traditions spoke of a sacred hill where ancient kings had once lived, a place of power and mystery. But the specific historical details faded with time, and by the colonial period, Mapungubwe had become a half-forgotten legend, dismissed by European observers who could not believe that Africans had built sophisticated kingdoms. The rediscovery of Mapungubwe came in December 1932, when a local farmer told European researchers about a hilltop where his workers had found gold artifacts. A team led by archaeologist E.S.J. Van Graan climbed the hill on New Year's Eve and found what had been left behind nearly 7 centuries earlier. The royal burial sites, the golden artifacts, the evidence of a sophisticated civilization that had been ignored or denied by colonial scholarship. The excavations that followed the 1932 to 1933 discoveries revealed a civilization that challenged every assumption about African history that had been taught in colonial schools and universities. Here was clear evidence of complex political organization, long-distance trade, advanced metallurgy, sophisticated architecture, and social stratification dating back to the 11th century. This was not a primitive tribal society, but a kingdom that had been wealthy, powerful, and culturally advanced during the same period when Europe was emerging from the so-called Dark Ages. The archaeological work at Mapungubwe has continued intermittently since the 1932, with major excavations in the 1932, 1940, and more recently, from the 1992 onward, using modern techniques. Each phase of research has added layers of understanding about the kingdom's society, economy, and culture. Modern archaeological methods, including radiocarbon dating, metallurgical analysis, paleobotanical studies, and geographic information systems, have provided increasingly detailed pictures of life in the ancient kingdom. One of the most significant findings has been the extent of Mapungubwe's trade connections. Chemical analysis of glass beads found at the site has traced their origins to manufacturing centers in India and Southeast Asia. Ceramic fragments have been matched to production sites in Persia and China. Cowrie shells from the Indian Ocean and marine shell beads from the East African coast demonstrate the kingdom's access to goods from thousands of kilometers away. This was not an isolated African community, but an active participant in medieval global commerce. The study of human remains from Mapungubwe burials has provided insights into health, diet, and social structure. Isotopic analysis of bones can reveal what people ate throughout their lives, showing differences between elite individuals who consumed more meat and dairy products and commoners whose diet was more grain-based. Skeletal evidence also shows signs of diseases, injuries, and life expectancy, painting a picture of the physical realities of life in the kingdom. Perhaps most importantly, Mapungubwe has become a symbol of African achievement and heritage. For South Africa in particular, the site represents a pre-colonial past, where African societies developed sophisticated civilizations independently, without European influence or control. The golden rhinoceros has become a national symbol, appearing on the South African coat of arms and on the country's highest honor, the Order of Mapungubwe. The site itself was declared a UNESCO World Heritage Site in 2003, recognized as having outstanding universal value. But the significance of Mapungubwe extends beyond symbolism. It fundamentally changes our understanding of African history. For too long, the dominant historical narrative portrayed Africa as a continent without history, without civilization, without significant achievement before European colonization. Sites like Mapungubwe prove this narrative false. They demonstrate that African societies developed complex political systems, engaged in long-distance trade, created impressive artistic and architectural works, and built kingdoms that were sophisticated by any measure. The kingdom also provides crucial context for understanding later developments in southern African history. Great Zimbabwe, which flourished from roughly 1,300 to 1,450, was clearly influenced by and possibly directly descended from Mapungubwe. The massive stone structures of Great Zimbabwe, far more elaborate than anything built at Mapungubwe, represented an evolution of the same basic cultural and political patterns. And Great Zimbabwe, in turn, gave rise to later kingdoms including Mutapa and Rozwi, creating a chain of sophisticated states that lasted until the 19th century. This continuity matters. It shows that Mapungubwe was not an isolated anomaly, but part of a long tradition of state formation, complex society, and cultural achievement in southern Africa. The specific kingdom may have disappeared, but the ideas, practices, and political models it developed continued to shape the region for centuries. Modern visitors to Mapungubwe can walk the paths that ancient traders once traveled, stand at the base of the sacred hill, and imagine what it must have looked like when the royal compound crowned its summit, and visit the interpretation center where artifacts from the site are displayed. The landscape remains beautiful and powerful, and it is not hard to understand why people chose this place to build their capital nearly 1,000 years ago. The mystery of Mapungubwe's disappearance has never been fully solved, and perhaps never will be. The combination of climate change, resource depletion, trade network disruption, and the emergence of rival centers of power provides a plausible explanation. But we cannot know with certainty what the people of Mapungubwe thought and felt as their kingdom declined. We cannot hear the debates that must have taken place about whether to stay or leave, cannot know the personal stories of families deciding to abandon their homes, cannot access the emotional reality of watching a great civilization fade away. What we can know is that Mapungubwe represents a crucial chapter in human history, one that reminds us that civilization has taken many forms across different times and places. The kingdom's achievements in trade, metallurgy, art, and political organization demonstrate the creativity and capacity of African societies to develop complex solutions to the challenges of their environments. The kingdom's eventual disappearance reminds us that all civilizations are fragile, dependent on environmental conditions, economic systems, and political stability that can shift in ways beyond any individual's control. The story of Mapungubwe also speaks to the importance of archaeological research and historical scholarship in recovering forgotten histories. Without the scientific investigation of the site, this kingdom would remain only a vague legend, its achievements unknown and unappreciated. Every artifact excavated, every building foundation mapped, every burial analyzed, adds to our collective human story, expanding our understanding of what humans have achieved and how diverse societies have addressed universal challenges. In recent years, there has been growing recognition that African history must be taught differently, that the old colonial narratives that portrayed Africa as a continent without history or civilization must be replaced with more accurate and complete accounts. Mapungubwe plays a crucial role in this transformation. It provides concrete, undeniable evidence that complex African civilizations existed long before European contact, that these societies were innovative, prosperous, and culturally sophisticated. The kingdom's legacy also raises important questions about heritage management and the politics of the past. Who has the right to interpret Mapungubwe's history? How should the site be preserved and presented? What role should descendant communities play in managing and interpreting the site? These are not just academic questions, but issues with real implications for how societies understand their pasts and construct their identities. For the modern nations that now occupy the territory where Mapungubwe once flourished, South Africa, Zimbabwe, and Botswana, the kingdom represents a shared heritage that transcends current borders. It reminds us that political boundaries are recent constructions, that the people who lived in this region centuries ago moved across landscapes without regard for lines that did not yet exist. There have been discussions about creating a transnational heritage site that would recognize Mapungubwe's importance to the entire region. The archaeological evidence from Mapungubwe continues to yield new insights as technology advances. Recent studies using LiDAR, light detection and ranging technology, have revealed settlement patterns and features that were not visible through traditional survey methods. Ground-penetrating radar has identified possible locations of additional burials and structures without requiring excavation. DNA analysis of human remains may eventually provide information about population movements and relationships between different communities in the region. One of the ongoing debates among scholars concerns the nature of political power at Mapungubwe. Was the king an absolute monarch with direct control over the entire kingdom, or was power more distributed among various chiefs and elite families? The archaeological evidence suggests a relatively decentralized system where local leaders maintained considerable autonomy while recognizing the paramount authority of the Mapungubwe ruler. This model of sacred kingship, combined with practical political flexibility, appears to have been the pattern for many southern African states. Another area of active research concerns the daily lives of ordinary people in the kingdom. While royal burials and elite artifacts naturally draw attention, understanding how farmers, herders, and craftspeople lived, worked, and experienced their society provides crucial context. Studies of settlement patterns, domestic architecture, food remains, and utilitarian objects are gradually building a picture of life beyond the hilltop palaces and gold ornaments. The environmental history of the Mapungubwe region continues to be investigated through multiple scientific approaches. Paleoclimatology studies using lake sediments, stalagmites, and other climate proxies are refining our understanding of exactly when and how severely climate change affected the region. These studies have implications beyond understanding Mapungubwe's collapse, as they provide data relevant to understanding current and future climate patterns in southern Africa. The role of disease in Mapungubwe's history remains largely unknown. In many historical societies, epidemics have played crucial roles in population decline and political disruption. Whether disease outbreaks affected Mapungubwe is impossible to determine from current evidence, but it remains a possibility that some researchers continue to explore. The concentration of population in the kingdom's settlements would have created conditions where infectious diseases could spread relatively easily if introduced through trade networks. The artistic legacy of Mapungubwe deserves particular attention. Beyond the famous golden rhinoceros, the kingdom produced a variety of ceramic vessels with distinctive styles, pottery figurines depicting humans and animals, bone tools with decorative carvings, and beadwork patterns that represented sophisticated aesthetic sensibilities. These artistic productions were not merely functional, but expressed cultural values, social identities, and creative vision. The craftspeople who produced these objects were artists working within established traditions, but also innovating and experimenting with forms and techniques. The ceramics of Mapungubwe show clear stylistic evolution over time, allowing archaeologists to create chronologies of the site's occupation. Early vessels display certain decorative patterns and manufacturing techniques, while later examples show different characteristics. These changes reflect both the natural evolution of craft traditions and possibly the arrival of new populations or ideas. Ceramic analysis has become one of the primary tools for understanding the relationship between Mapungubwe and other contemporary sites in the region. The spiritual and ritual life of the kingdom remains one of the most difficult aspects to reconstruct. We can identify the locations where ceremonies were performed, the objects that were used in rituals, and the burial practices that reflected beliefs about death and the afterlife. But the specific beliefs, myths, and religious practices that gave meaning to these activities are largely lost. Some researchers attempt to work backward from the religious practices of later Southern African societies, assuming continuity in basic spiritual concepts, but this approach has obvious limitations. What we can say with confidence is that ritual and religion were central to Mapungubwe's political system. The king's authority rested partly on his role as ritual specialist and intermediary with spiritual forces. The separation of the royal residence from commoner settlements was not just political but sacred. The objects placed in elite burials were not merely wealth displays, but items with spiritual significance. Understanding the kingdom's politics requires understanding its spiritual dimensions. The question of why the hilltop itself was abandoned so completely remains intriguing. In many cases, when populations decline or relocate, sites remain partially occupied or are reoccupied during later periods. But Mapungubwe appears to have been abandoned entirely and permanently. This suggests that the site itself may have been considered problematic or spiritually compromised. If the rains failed while the royal rituals were being performed on the sacred hill, if the ancestors seemed to have withdrawn their protection, the site itself might have been viewed as no longer suitable for human habitation. The migration from Mapungubwe to Great Zimbabwe and other sites represented not just a physical relocation, but a cultural transformation. While many elements of Mapungubwe's civilization continued in the new locations, there were also changes and innovations. Great Zimbabwe developed more elaborate stone architecture than anything built at Mapungubwe. The scale of gold production and trade appears to have increased at the new centers. Political organizations may have become more centralized. These developments suggest that people learned from Mapungubwe's experience, adapting and improving the systems that had proven vulnerable. The role of individual agency and leadership in Mapungubwe's rise and fall should not be overlooked. While environmental and economic factors created the conditions for change, specific decisions by rulers, chiefs, and ordinary people shaped how events unfolded. A more capable or innovative king might have found ways to adapt to changing conditions. Different policy choices regarding resource management, trade relationships, or population distribution might have altered outcomes. We cannot know the names or personalities of the individuals who made these decisions, but their choices mattered. One of the most poignant aspects of Mapungubwe's story is the gap between the kingdom's historical importance and its modern obscurity. While everyone has heard of ancient Egypt, Greece, or Rome, Relatively few people outside of southern Africa know about Mapungubwe. This is partly due to the biases of historical education, which has traditionally focused overwhelmingly on European and Mediterranean civilizations. But it also reflects the challenges of doing archaeology and history in regions where written records do not exist, where oral traditions have been disrupted, and where colonial-era scholarship actively denied or minimized African achievements. The recovery and recognition of Mapungubwe's history is therefore not just an academic exercise, but a form of historical justice. It restores to prominence a civilization that deserves to be remembered, studied, and celebrated. It provides people of African descent, whether on the continent or in diaspora communities, with a heritage of achievement and sophistication that counters centuries of demeaning stereotypes. And it enriches human history as a whole by adding another chapter to the diverse story of how humans have organized societies, created cultures, and built civilizations across the planet. Looking at Mapungubwe from the perspective of world history, several aspects stand out as particularly significant. First, the kingdom demonstrates that complex state formation occurred in sub-Saharan Africa independently and at time periods contemporary with similar developments in other regions. This challenges outdated theories that portrayed state formation as a process that diffused from supposed centers of civilization to supposedly backward peripheries. Mapungubwe shows that the capacity to develop complex political organization is universal, emerging when local conditions make such organization advantageous. Second, Mapungubwe's extensive participation in Indian Ocean trade networks challenges the notion that Africa was isolated from global systems before European colonization. The kingdom was connected to a vast commercial network linking East Africa, the Arabian Peninsula, South Asia, and ultimately East Asia. African gold and ivory were valued commodities in distant markets, and African societies actively engaged in the commercial relationships that brought foreign goods to their communities. This was not passive exploitation, but active participation in medieval globalization. Third, the kingdom's eventual disappearance reminds us that environmental factors have always shaped human societies in profound ways. Climate change in the 13th century was not caused by human activity, but its impacts on Mapungubwe were nevertheless severe. Understanding how past societies responded to environmental challenges provides valuable perspective on current climate issues, showing both the vulnerabilities of human systems to environmental change and the adaptive strategies that societies can employ. Fourth, Mapungubwe illustrates the importance of archaeological evidence in reconstructing history. In the absence of written records from the kingdom itself, archaeology provides the primary means of understanding what happened there. Every object excavated, every structure mapped, every scientific analysis performed adds to knowledge that would otherwise be lost. This underscores the critical importance of protecting archaeological sites and supporting professional archaeological research. The preservation challenges facing Mapungubwe are significant. The site is relatively remote, making management and protection difficult. Natural erosion continues to affect the hilltop and surrounding areas. Climate change may accelerate deterioration. Tourism, while providing economic benefits and raising awareness, also creates potential for damage. Balancing preservation with access, education, and community benefit requires ongoing effort and resources. There have been controversies over the years about the excavation and display of artifacts from Mapungubwe, particularly the golden rhinoceros and other royal burial goods. Some argue that removing these objects from their original contexts and displaying them in museums constitutes a form of disturbance or disrespect to the dead. Others contend that careful excavation and curation preserves these artifacts for future generations and allows them to serve educational purposes. These debates reflect broader tensions in archaeology and heritage management about the ethics of excavation and the ownership of the past. The influence of Mapungubwe on contemporary political symbolism in South Africa has been profound. When the democratic government designed a new coat of arms after the end of apartheid, they deliberately chose imagery from Mapungubwe to represent the nation's heritage. The golden rhinoceros, flanked by elephant tusks and wheat stalks, stands at the center of the coat of arms, with a motto in the extinct Sam language of the Khoisan people. This symbolism was intended to root the new South Africa in African heritage rather than colonial history, to represent all South Africans by referencing a pre-colonial past and to assert pride in African civilization. For scholars studying comparative history, Mapungubwe offers interesting parallels and contrasts with other early states and kingdoms. Like many early complex societies, it was based on agricultural surplus, control of valuable trade goods, and social hierarchy reinforced by ideology and physical separation of elites from commoners. But the specific forms these elements took were shaped by African environmental conditions, cultural traditions, and historical circumstances. Comparing Mapungubwe with early states in Mesopotamia, Mesoamerica, or Southeast Asia reveals both universal patterns in state formation and unique local variations. The question of what might have happened if environmental conditions had remained favorable continues to intrigue scholars. Would Mapungubwe have continued to grow and develop? Might it have built the kind of monumental stone architecture that later appeared at Great Zimbabwe? Could it have maintained its political dominance over the region indefinitely? These counterfactual questions cannot be answered definitively, but they remind us that history is contingent, that small changes in conditions can produce dramatically different outcomes. The legacy of Mapungubwe in oral traditions and local knowledge deserves more attention than it has sometimes received. While the specific historical details of the kingdom faded over centuries, local communities maintained some awareness of the site's significance. These oral traditions, while not historically precise in the way written records might be, preserved a cultural memory that the hill was important, that powerful people had once lived there, that it was a place deserving respect. Understanding and recording these traditions is important both for what they reveal about cultural memory and for involving descendant communities in heritage management. Education about Mapungubwe in South African schools has increased significantly since the end of apartheid. While earlier curricula largely ignored pre-colonial African history or presented it in dismissive ways, contemporary education standards include substantial content about kingdoms like Mapungubwe. This represents an important shift in how young South Africans understand their heritage, providing a sense of historical depth and achievement that connects to African identity rather than to colonial narratives. The site has become an important destination for heritage tourism, with thousands of visitors annually coming to see where Africa's first gold empire once flourished. A well-designed interpretation center provides context and displays replicas of major artifacts. The originals are held in climate-controlled museum conditions. Visitors can climb the sacred hill, walk through the ancient settlement areas, and experience the landscape that shaped this remarkable civilization. This tourism provides economic benefits to local communities while raising awareness about Southern African heritage. Looking toward the future, research at Mapungubwe continues to evolve as new technologies and approaches become available. Environmental DNA analysis might eventually provide information about what plants and animals were present in the past. Advanced materials analysis could reveal more about manufacturing techniques and trade connections. Computational modeling could simulate how changes in climate or trade networks might have affected the kingdom's sustainability. Each generation of researchers brings new questions and new tools to understand this ancient civilization. The story of Mapungubwe ultimately is a story about human resilience, creativity, and adaptation. It is about people who looked at their environment and saw opportunities, who organized themselves into a sophisticated society, who created beautiful objects and impressive structures, who participated in global networks of exchange, and who built a civilization that lasted for over 2 centuries. It is also a story about the fragility of human achievements, about how environmental changes and shifting conditions can undermine even successful societies, about the hard decisions people must make when the foundations of their world begin to erode. For those of us seeking to understand human history in its full complexity, Mapungubwe offers crucial lessons. It teaches us that civilization takes many forms, that sophistication and achievement are not the monopoly of any particular region or people, that African societies developed impressive kingdoms long before European contact. It reminds us that history is not inevitable, that societies rise and fall in response to changing conditions, that adaptability and innovation are essential for survival. And it demonstrates the power of archaeology and historical research to recover forgotten stories and restore them to their rightful place in the human narrative.